And that's actually quite a great segue to go into the next presenter, Tom Giessel. And Tom began his farming career in 1975 after college and a short stint as a geologist. Tom and his wife Cheryl are engaged with their community and raised their three children on the farm. Tom's been involved with the Farmers Union at both the state and national level for many years. Tom is recognized as an expert in the history of farming in rural communities. He has served as the honorary historian for the National Farmers Union for the past 15 years. Thank you, Tom, for coming here this evening and adding your insight to the discussions. What what could you add to this start that Vance and Louise have given us, and what are some of the major changes in farming in rural communities that you have discovered through your research and experiences?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I grew up on the farm. I went away to college for 4 years up at Hayes and got my geology degree and worked as a geologist and came back. Give you just a little bit of background. I farmed with my father and brother until my father passed away about 35 years ago or so. And then I farmed with my brother until about 10 years ago after he got a divorce from his wife, and then that ended that. But it's given me an interesting perspective. Growing up on the farm, I'd like to talk just a little bit about that. I'm 70 years old, and what it was like and how it's evolved. And a lot of this I look at from the perspective of studying local history and history of farm organizations. But one thing I can say, when I was growing up, yes, we didn't have the technology, but one thing we have that I think we've lost that's important is mentoring. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was being mentored every day by my father, and I was being taught things more than just how to produce a bushel of wheat, but how to live on the land, how to be part of a community, how to contribute, all these things that I think go into creating communities. And I think as we get into the machine age, which is another aspect of I've learned from studying my history of my Farmers Union organization, and there's a lot to be said about that, but I just can't get into all that. But had a lot to do with cooperatives and people cooperating, and the idea of cooperation as opposed to competition, and how valuable that can be. I mean, that's how the very first farm bills prior to the AAA program was all about cooperatives and federating cooperatives and marketing grain through them. Anyway, I digress there quite a bit, but as time went on, I enjoyed that too, because we grew up putting up alfalfa hay and handling bales by hand. And I remember getting a bale wagon and moving through all these technologies and how wonderful it is and how labor saving, and it is good and it is healthy. But historically, you look at what went on. There have been large farms forever. Back in the 1920s, International Harvester, if you went into a dealership back then, every dealership had a plaque on the wall that said every farm a factory. And they were trying to promote getting larger, getting bigger. And there was a guy by the name of Thomas Campbell up in Montana that worked on building huge farms, 40, 50,000 acre farms. And he went over to Russia and set up the collective farms too. There's an excellent book by Deborah Fitzgerald, and it has that title, Every Farm a Factory. So this expansion is nothing new. We went from an early history with slave labor in the Southeast to machine, and from machine to technology. And we've also went from when we came out in this part of the world, when the Anglos came out and basically took this land, it was laid out in a grid. So people used their creativity and made that grid what it is today and what it was yesterday, and some of it is today. They use their creativity, and now we farm by the grid. I've seen the evolution. My farm, my dad's farm, I'm think of fourth generation actually. we had a pretty diverse farm in those days. We had livestock, we had, we had all those things, and gradually we got away from that to where we were just, my brother and I were just grain farmers and a little bit of hay. And I've always kind of looked back at my early days and thought about what's different about that farm and what's different about it today outside of the technology is the amount of beating hearts on that farm. When I grew up, there were beating hearts everywhere. We had cattle, we had sheep, we had hogs, we had chickens. There were kids, there were neighbor kids, there were family, all of these things, the birds, all these animals. And it evolved to where there are very few beating hearts. In fact, I retired last year at 70, and the only beating hearts on my farmstead is my wife and I, and some birds and a few animals. But I think it's a statement about our evolution and what we did. And yes, some of it is somewhat inevitable. But the other thing I think that kind of created this, and the one that, I don't know, just my opinion, the elephant in the room that nobody talks about is poverty. And the reason a lot of people farm 4 or 5 or 10,000 acres because they have to generate that mass to make a living. So when you do that, as the booms get wider, the undercutters get wider, your neighbors get farther, your communities diminish, and it's kind of self-perpetuating. When I have to raise 80,000 bushel of wheat instead of 8,000 bushel of wheat to sustain a family, well, then I've kicked out 9 other of my neighbors to do that, which kicks out 9 more kids out of school. And it just goes right down the line. I don't think it's impossible to kind of slow down the evolution by, I just don't think I think it is possible, because what's happened with farm bills and farm legislation and farmers, I think we have to recognize that we went from producing food to producing commodities. And a lot of these, and there's nothing inherently wrong about that, but we become that factory. And if I think we get desensitized to why we do it and how we do it. And not everybody, but the idea of isolation, I'd like to touch on that just briefly. When this country was settled out here, one of the big issues was isolation and communication. And people want to get together. They understood that if they worked together, and they did it through the form of cooperatives, they would all do well. Like Paul Wilson always said we all do better when we all do better. And we found a way to do that without having a neighbor. I'm as guilty in my own life and my evolution of my farm. I didn't mentor my son to be a farmer because when he was very young, I didn't necessarily trust him to get on a 4-wheel drive tractor or a $200,000 piece of equipment and just say, go do it. As opposed to when I was growing up. When I was growing up, if you hit something with hit the hammy on a telephone pole, you just went to the yard, welded, fixed it, went on. Now you do that and it costs you $100,000. So in one sense, all of our technology and all these advancements have made it an exclusive instead of an inclusive agriculture, in my opinion. It's created it's made us isolated. In fact, I would contend that we may be more isolated today than we were 100 years ago, because not only do we isolate from our neighbors and get larger, but I sat in a cab, which I'm glad to have, believe me, I think that's good. But I isolate myself from the weather, from smells, from taste, from hearing. I don't even really, if I had the technology, I wouldn't touch the steering wheel. I wouldn't decide what was going on. And I think it desensitizes you to what agriculture and farming is all about. The root word of agriculture is culture. And that is the part that I know a lot of people say, well, that's just fluff. But no, I think it's very real, because I look at what's happened to how we created our communities and what's happened to our communities. And now, as I get ready for retirement, I'm trying to figure out how to recreate communities. And we should be doing that all the time. Instead of saying we're going to consolidate them, how do we recreate them? They may not look, they're not going to look exactly like they did, but that's my one of my takes on it. You know, I think farm organizations, and it's an interesting thing because there's really only three general farm organizations left: Farmers Union, Farm Bureau, and the Grange. The Grange is not real active, but what's really come into play the last 30 years or so are the commodity organizations, and they operate without dues, although the dues that you pay are required by law. It's a checkoff on your grains, it's a checkoff on your livestock, and you're paying literally millions of dollars. I think I figured a while back, Pawnee County was paying him like $400,000 to $70,000 of checkoffs to commodity organizations. And that's fine, but you know, commodity organizations promote the commodity. Farm organizations, especially general farm organizations, promote and protect the people and communities. And there is really a real difference there. We have worked our way into this, and we're not going to stop, you know, just because, you know, my brother and I were farming 5,000 to 6,000 acres at the peak. You know, that land's being farmed today. It didn't make any difference that he is gone, that I'm gone. But I think the contributions we made to our community have been and were very, very meaningful. And I think what we need to do, as in, you know, back in the late 1890s, William Jennings Bryan and some others had a poverty and progress dinner in New York City every year. And it was really kind of an interesting, they talked about these things even back then. It was an interesting thing. And I read a little about it, but one of the statements that came out of one of those was, the greatest thing we can pass on to our children is opportunity. It wasn't land, it wasn't money, it wasn't all these other wealths that would come and go, but we had to promote opportunity. And that's why as I am learning about retiring, I'm trying to figure out how to unstack the bricks, not pass on what I have, because what I have and what made a living for me and what made a life for me and what created a community for me, I need to pass on, to let somebody else unstack those bricks of what I built and create their own community. You know, I think we get too tied up and sometimes thinking, well, we need to put this in a trust to protect it. Protect it for who and for what? And I'm not saying trust are bad things, but I think we haven't really thought this through as a society and as general food and fiber policy very well through to the end to see what our goal actually is. I don't know if we've really actually decided or come to a conclusion, and maybe you can't, of what our goal should be as we go through this process of, you know, engaging in agriculture, you know, living in a community, but then leaving. I think it's just as important to figure out how you exit as how you enter. So